Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 3 p.m. in Geneva. Let me start our session. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this session of the WTO Public Forum under the theme Building Productive Capacities in LLDCs in a post-COVID world. As you all know, there are 32 landlocked developing countries. LLDCs were already among the most disadvantaged countries in the world economy before the crisis, and hence the pandemic has further accelerating the vulnerable situation. Average growth rate in landlocked developing countries have slowed since 2014. Similarly, the share of landlocked developing countries in global merchandise exports has fallen rather than doubled compared to 2014. Our geographical position and dependence on transport, as well as multiple border crossing, continue to pose obstacles to our socio-economic development. High trade costs remain a defining common challenge of landlocked developing countries, reducing the competitiveness of our exports on the world market and rising import prices. 26 of 32 LLDCs depends on the commodities, more than 60% of the export earnings. As a result, our economies are prone to boom and both cycles in line with commodities prices. Commodity dependence can also lead to overvalued currencies and unequal growth patterns. Overcoming commodity dependence and achieving sustained and inclusive growth requires efforts to diversify exports and achieve structural transformation. In this regard, the new policy tool of the Productive Capacities Index, PCA, developed by UNCTAD, could be an important instrument to identify policies and measures that would support LLDCs in building productive capacities. Our session will explore the impact of the pandemic on landlocked developing countries and their development prospects, and the policies and measures required to build resilience. In this context, we will discuss UNCTAD's new Productive Capacities Index as tool to inform policymakers. For this task, we have today 4 distinguished panelists. Mr. Paul Akiwumi, Director of the Division for Africa, LDCs, and the Special Programs at the UNCTAD. Dr. Chukwuka Anikabana, Executive Director of the Center for Studies of the Economies of Africa. Ms. Heidi Schroeder-Fox, Director, UN Office of the High Representative for LLDCs, and SIDS. Unfortunately, Ms. Shishir Priyadashi, Director of the Development Division at the World Trade Organization, is unable to join today due to unforeseen circumstances. However, we have today Mr. Raul Torres, Chancellor of the Development Division at the WTO, is participating today at the session on his behalf here together with me in Rome. I thank all the panelists for having accepted our invitation and joining us today. I would like to begin our panelists with Mr. Paul Akiwumi. Mr. Akiwumi, a national of Ghana, joined UNCTAD in 2017. He previously served as Director of Economic, Social, and Development Affairs Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations in New York, and Chief of Staff in the Office of Deputy Secretary General, where he played a crucial role in strengthening the development pillar of the Office of Secretary General. He also held appointment with the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Mr. Akiwumi has served as Senior Advisor to the Global Environment Facility, Chief Executive Officer, and Secretary to GAF Council in Washington, D.C. So, Mr. Akiwumi, I have two questions particular to you. First, what is the role of productive capacities in building resilience in LLDCs in post-COVID-19 environment? The second question I would like to hear from you is, how can LLDCs harness the natural capital to foster productive capacities to build resilience against shocks? Thank you. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and it's a pleasure for me to be with you once again on the panel. I'd like to also welcome my co-panelists, and I'd like to thank you, Ambassador, for your initiative and to jointly participate in hosting this event. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Ambassador mentioned earlier on, we all are aware of the problems that LLDCs face, the major challenges they face, which includes the weak productive capacities, the lack of structural transformation, economic diversification, and various trade and logistic issues arising from their lack of access to the sea. And given these circumstances and difficulties, this is the major task ahead for LLDCs themselves, and with the support of the international community, as the Ambassador mentioned, is to build their resilience to these challenges and strengthen their capacity to respond to and recover from these external shocks. Now, as a result of these significant challenges, LLDCs were already falling behind before the global pandemic in 2020. And the average GDP growth in 2014 has been lower than in previous years prior to the adoption of the Vienna Program of Action. And I think that's a noteworthy statistics. Similarly, the share of LLDCs in global merchandise exports has fallen rather than doubled, as foreseen in the Vienna Program of Action. And aggregate FDI flows in LLDCs are falling, representing only 1.5% of total FDI. Now, the global pandemic has, without a doubt, has greatly exacerbated these challenges. And in addition to that, the sanitary measures led to border closures and longer processing times at crossings, border crossings, and then increasing, of course, the trade costs for LLDCs. And finally, falling commodity prices, which reduced the export revenues just when the pandemic required an increase in domestic spending. And this has also resulted in mounting debt burden in many countries. In 2020, LLDCs are therefore estimated to have been seen in a fall of income by about 2.4% on average. And some saw contractions exceeding 8%. Now, addressing these complex and interactive development challenges certainly requires, in our belief and UNCTAD's belief, a paradigm shift towards a new generation of development policymaking. As we know, business as usual approach will no longer be an option, but more importantly, should no longer be an option. It's not about will, should no longer be an option. And we believe the new generation of policies should not also be underpinned on old development models and old international support measures. In this regard, there has to be a shift away from a development model focused on commodity extraction or on low value added manufacturing, which has essentially locked these countries into only marginal participation in a global value chains. Now, in this context, the immediate priority, naturally, in this context of the COVID pandemic, is to fight the pandemic. But there is also a need that LLDCs have to build resilience along and in the future. And in UNCTAD's view, to overcome their deep-rooted development challenges and embark on a new growth trajectory, LLDCs need to focus on building productive capacities. Now, UNCTAD's developed this concept of productive capacities several years ago, and it was developed because it was an innovative way of capturing all the elements that enable an economy to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth. The broad concept also reflects factors such as natural resources, physical capital, and human capital, as well as entrepreneurship capabilities and production linkages, such as technology skills and integration into global value chain. The emphasis, however, on productive capacities was needed primarily because many developing countries in Africa and Latin America were unable to translate the high economic growth of the early 2000s into significant job creation, poverty reduction, or productivity growth. Now, this period of jobless growth was largely due to an excessive focus on commodity exports. And in contrast, many East Asian economies managed to achieve inclusive growth by focusing on building productive capacities. And in order to operationalize the concept of productive capacities for policymakers, UNCTAD recently launched this Productive Capacity Index, which the ambassador mentioned. Now, the PCI measures productive capacity along 8 components: natural capital, human capital, energy, ICTs, institutions, transport, structural transformation, and the private sector. And these components are also measured using 46 indicators. And this allows us to benchmark the performance of countries over time. And not surprising, when we actually use the index to look at LLDCs, the performance of LLDCs is amongst the lowest. Indeed, the average scores of LLDCs is far below that of other developing countries in all categories, except, as you would expect, natural capital. And in part, this also clearly reflects the continuing dependence on the commodities. Now, harnessing natural capital in LLDCs to boost resilience is critical. And to build the resilience against shocks like COVID-19 pandemic and its knock-on effect that it's had, LLDCs need to build forward, most importantly, forward differently and transform their economies. They need to focus their efforts on building the productive capacities, leveraging the strong natural capital base that they have, and achieving structural transformation of their economies. Now, this proposed shift away from the commodity-driven growth model calls for placing productive capacities at the center of domestic policies and strategies, as well as rebalancing development with equal emphasis. Now, I'd like to stress that, with equal emphasis on the productive sectors of the economy. Policies and strategies should seek ways also and means of tapping the comparative advantages, relieve binding constraints, and building competitiveness and economy-wide productive capacities. Now, the UNCTAD Productive Capacity Index is, one should not only think of it as merely a statistical tool. It is designed to improve development policy formulation and implementation. And in this regard, LLDCs are encouraged to apply the PCI in formulating their respective development policies. The index can also help them identify gaps and constraints in building their productive capacity and assist in monitoring their performance over time at the national level. And I'm pleased to inform you that UNCTAD has already embarked on undertaking national productive capacities gap assessment for several countries, including LLDCs. And we have also been requested to undertake such analysis on regional economic groupings and trading blocks to which several LLDCs are members. Now, for LLDCs can harness their natural wealth to finance the building of productive capacities. However, this requires sound management of their natural resources, including through the sovereign welfare funds and clear budgetary rules for their use, as well as management of foreign exchange inflows to manage domestic currency and the need to address illicit financial flows. Naturally, improvements in transit, transport, and trade facilitation are, of course, essential prerequisites for supporting the LLDCs. But I don't think we can stop there. Alone, they are not enough to address the persistent and underlying challenges facing LLDCs. And this is why focusing on productive capacities and building new ones, whilst also maintaining and utilizing existing capacities, needs to be at the heart of policies to shape a more resilient future for LLDCs. And only then can countries recover sustainably and develop, once again, I re-emphasize, differently. Now, LLDCs also need stronger support from the international community to address these challenges. And so far, we all have to recognize that the approach has been fragmented and piecemeal at best. And there is a need for us to focus also on a new generation of international support measures that will focus and support a new generation of development models. Now, the Vienna Program of Action is still near its final phase, and it's imperative that we continue to build the productive capacities to be the center of development policies in order that that can be achieved. What is important now that there are opportunities available for LLDCs, and this is very much opportunities in UNCTAD 15 for them to stress very clearly their priorities and need to move to a new development model and the need for new international support measures to support that new development model. And lastly, of course, there is the whole Doha Program of Action, which will be happening 2022 in Qatar. And there's a golden opportunity there as well, that we move away from business as usual. We do things differently than we have done in the past. And with those few words, Mr. Chair, I'd like to end my presentation there. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Akewumi. It was very interesting, and we will come back definitely to that each 8 components and then 46 indicators from that PSA. And I would like to now invite our next speaker is Miss Heidi Schroeder-Fox. Heidi Schroeder-Fox was appointed as Director of the United Nations Office of the High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing countries in July 2012. During 2010-2011, she served as head of the policy issues for the Office of the President of the United Nations General Assembly. In this capacity, she advised the President of PGA on all policy issues under consideration. So Ms. Schroeder-Fox holds a rank of ambassador in the Finnish Foreign Service. During her 24 years of the work for the Finland, Ms. Schroeder-Fox held a succession of increasing leadership positions at the Finnish Foreign Ministry and the diplomatic postings in Paris, Washington, D.C., Tel Aviv, Geneva, Pretoria. Also, she served as Deputy Permanent Representative of the Finland to the UN in New York. And I have one question particular to you, Ms. Schroeder-Fox. What is the role of the development partners in supporting LLDCs in fostering productive capacities in the post-COVID-19 world, especially in implementation of the Vienna Program of Action? It remains now only 3 years left. So thank you. And then Ms. Schroeder Schroeder's Fox, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, our moderator, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, and my fellow panelists. It's a great pleasure to be here, and let me thank the organizers warmly for organizing this side event during the WTO public forum and on building productive capacities in the landlocked developing countries post-COVID. Our discussion, I think, is a very, very important one, as many of the most vulnerable countries in the world continue to struggle in the wake of COVID. And as you, Mr. Moderator, has said, the issues of the landlocked, I find that in the discussions with many of the development partners, the issues and the special situation and the challenges of the landlocked is not always fully understood. So these kind of side events are extremely important, and I really congratulate the organizers. In LLDCs, the pandemic has highlighted an urgent need to address their underlying vulnerabilities. And as we look forward to UNCTAD 15, and the 5th UN conference on the least developed countries that will take place in Doha in January of 2022, this discussion could not be more timely. The pandemic made clear that building productive capacities in the landlocked countries is a priority for sustainable recovery and for building long-term resilience. The pandemic disproportionately impacted the landlocked countries' economic growth due to their geographical disadvantages. It also exacerbated inequalities, reversed poverty alleviation, and increased vulnerable employment. Trade and transit restrictions deprived many landlocked countries of critical and life-saving supplies and impaired their capacity to protect their populations. Even before the pandemic hit, and as was already mentioned by my colleague Paul from UNCTAD, a number of factors highlighted the increasing importance of the development of productive capacities in the landlocked countries. Most notably, the transition towards sustainability and the growing role of technology in manufacturing. Climate change means an extensive overhaul across the energy, transportation, and manufacturing domains will be needed in the coming years. All of this will rely on the development of new technologies underpinned by an upgrading of productive capacities. Similarly, participation in the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0, will be contingent on having a sufficiently developed productive capacity space to absorb new technologies. This transition is likely to occur in an increasingly competitive landscape, and the landlocked countries are at the heightened risk of being left behind. That means the role of international development partners to help the landlocked countries is paramount, both in the context of building back better, as well as for developing long-term economic resilience and vibrancy. There are already some successful examples of development partners' contributions in this area. The French, for example, Choose Africa initiative is supporting many small and medium firms in African LLDCs in diverse industries such as agro-food processing and finance. The support provided includes seed financing, but more importantly, technical capacity building and human capital development. Partners such as UNDP have a project to promote the transfer of renewable energy technology from China to Zambia, with the participation of both public and private sector stakeholders from both countries. Development partners are also contributing to the development of productive capacities in landlocked developing countries indirectly by investing in transport infrastructure projects. For example, 22% of the World Bank's total transport-related programs have focused on enhancing connectivity and regional integration in the landlocked. Excellencies, you will recall that my office, OHR LLS, recently coordinated the development of the roadmap of accelerated implementation of the Vienna Program of Action. This followed guidance from the UN Secretary General and it was requested by the landlocked developing countries themselves. This roadmap provides the framework for accelerated action in areas that require dedicated and urgent focus. It has concrete activities and deliverables by the UN system. Developing productive capacities is addressed by all the priority areas of the roadmap, either directly or indirectly, and in particular, priority area 5 on structural economic transformation has specific focus on this area, including a number of specific goals and objectives. Our office has been tasked with leading regular reviews of the roadmap and its implementation. The Interagency Consultative Group on landlocked developing countries recently met and reviewed in detail the implementation of the roadmap, including priority area 5. A large number of partners reported progress. These include UNCTAD, FAO, the International Development Law Organization, UNIDO, African Development Bank, and Common Fund for Commodities, just to mention a few. Significant additional efforts are still needed, however, on the part of development partners in supporting the landlocked developing countries. The challenges facing these countries remain, and the roadmap for the accelerated implementation of the Vienna Programme of Action is a living document. It will constantly be updated with inputs from partner organizations. In addition, another meeting of the Interagency Consultative Group is planned in the final quarter of this year. This will produce a thorough stocktake of activities of development partners in all priority areas of the Vienna Programme of Action. We are also currently specifically working on 2 knowledge products that will directly address the issues of developing productive capacities in the landlocked developing countries. The first is a report on strengthening LLDCs participation in global and regional value chain. And the second is a report on enhancing the role of FDI for structural transformation in the landlocked. We are organizing an event on the role of the private sector in implementing the Vienna Programme of Action, where we will present the findings of these 2 reports. We will also announce additional avenues to support the landlocked for strengthening productive capacities in post-COVID world. OHRLS also continues to advocate for the implementation of the Vienna Programme of Action amongst all the stakeholders. Accelerated implementation will require enhanced focus and support from development partners, very importantly, from transit countries, from South-South partners, from UN development system, from the multilateral development banks, from the IMF and private sector and foundations. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take this opportunity to encourage all landlocked developing countries to actively engage in the implementation of the roadmap. Some of these activities set in the roadmap are demand-driven, and therefore member states need to approach the implementing entities to request for support. OHR-LLS will continue to mobilize the relevant UN system capacities. We will ensure coordinated follow-up on the implementation of the Vienna Programme of Action, as well as the roadmap for its accelerated implementation. As the pandemic is predicted to move millions more people into poverty, we cannot afford to lose focus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Schroeder-Fox, for your presentation. I would like to remind the participants on the housekeeping issues. You could ask the questions using the chat function, and I'm going to read it out for the panelists. Now we have left 2 more panelists, and I would like to remind also panelists also about 5-6 minutes, and then we should have enough time for the Q&A. And then at the end, I'm going to give us each one maybe minutes to the panelists to wrap up. And now I would like to invite the next panelist, Dr. Anikwana. Dr. Chukwaka Anikwana is the Executive Director of the Center for Study of the Economies of Africa. He is also the Chair of the advisory board of the Africa Portal, a member of the steering committee of the Southern Voice, and a member of the African Policy Circle. His research interests include foreign direct investment, trade, global economic governance, education equality, energy, agricultural productivity, and financial inclusion. Please, Dr. Anikwana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, His Excellency Ambassador. Thank you very much, co-panelists. It's really a pleasure to be part of this very interesting discussion on building productive capacities in LLDCs, landlocked countries, in a post-COVID world. I must say I've also been part of the gap assessment of PCI in several countries, particularly in Africa. So it's quite interesting to contribute to this discussion. So I'll be touching on the key binding constraints of LLDCs and also point out some areas with growth potentials briefly. So most landlocked developing countries, particularly in Africa, as we mentioned by the moderator and Paul, they'll be facing some binding constraints. They've been mentioned in the past, but I'll just highlight them here as constraints in particular. A key one is high reliance on natural resources. The economy of most landlocked countries, particularly in Africa, are really based on extraction of natural resources and agriculture. And this can be seen from their PCI indicator for natural capital, which is always relatively high, and high in this case means above 50. This is the case of landlocked countries such as Central African Republic, Chad, and Zambia. You know, in fact, once you see a high natural capital indicator, it corresponds with low values for infrastructure, institutions, and other key indicators that signify structural transformation, economic competitiveness, and development. So natural resource in this case has been more of a resource cost for these countries, particularly in Africa. And then the reliance, this high reliance, has also increased their vulnerability to shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a huge shock. And in Africa and in many other regions, it was accompanied by a fall in commodity prices. And most of the African countries and landlocked developing countries also met the pandemic in a very weak position. Weak in the sense of they were battling with other socioeconomic challenges. And then here comes the pandemic, which triggered, broad negative consequences both on their fiscal positions. And now in LLDCs, there have been concerns about rising debt and debt sustainability. Also, in line with the high reliance on natural resources, in some landlocked countries such as Central African Republic and Chad, the competition over the control of these natural resources have also triggered prolonged conflicts, which has destabilized the economic and political foundations for development. So in essence, the existence of natural resource has done more harm than good. So another binding constraint, that is seen across LLDCs, particularly in Africa, is weak infrastructure. LLDCs, particularly in Africa, have weak infrastructure to support economic development. They usually score low on PCI indicators for energy, transport, and ICT. They have weak policy and governance frameworks to increase energy access, develop road and air infrastructure, given the high cost of transportation costs as in the case of these landlocked countries. They also need to increase ICT penetration. These are the key difficulties and challenges they are facing in building infrastructure. And the low performance in these energy, transport, and ICTs have been key inhibiting factors for the industrial takeoff. Because these key areas are enablers of industrialization, and we continue to perform poorly in those areas. Another binding constraint is within these LLDCs is that they have weak institutions. Poor institutional performance makes business environment unconducive, and it also undermines private sector investments. Landlocked countries, particularly in Africa, have faced prolonged conflicts and insecurity, which have weakened institutional bedrocks like property rights, rule of law, transparency, and accountability. Thus, the much needed coherence between trade and industrial policies remain limited due to these weak institutional capacity. So these are the key constraints faced by these LLDCs. And I must say that to tackle these constraints, it's a mixture of political will, structural and institutional reforms, to be able to, tackle these challenges, particularly through diversification of the economies and heavy investment in infrastructure. In terms of sectors with key growth potentials that I see for landlocked countries, one of huge importance is the ICT sector. One of the key lessons learned from COVID-19 is the importance of digitalization and connectivity. A lot of the activities and services can be carried out digitally without incurring much cost like the transportation costs faced by landlocked countries. ICT and digitalization presents growth potentials for landlocked countries, as it can increase productivity in different sectors and enhance service delivery. However, given the low level of ICT penetration in these landlocked countries, huge external financing will be needed to stimulate the sector. Another key sector of growth potential is agriculture. Many landlocked countries have high agricultural products, as reflected in their high natural capital in their PCI indicator. But they have been unable to build processing capacity to move up in the global value chains. Therefore, there is need for concerted efforts to explore strategies to build and strengthen post-harvest facilities for processing, storage, and packaging, as well as in transportation. In Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has just started, is deemed to boost inter-African trade and strengthen value chain development in agriculture. And these present huge opportunities for landlocked developing countries in Africa. So yeah, these are my few words, and thank you very much for the attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Anikwana. You touched on some very interesting topics, ICT and agriculture, also the global value chain, processing and industries, and also the storage and transportation. I will come definitely back to you, some questions. So let's move now, our last but not least panelists. I would like to invite now the Mr. Raul Torres from WTO, and Raul is the head of the Development Policy Unit in the Development Division of the WTO. He is also WTO's focal point for the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the international trade integration of the landlocked developing countries. He has been employed by the WTO since 1996 starting the rule divisions where he worked on the issues as anti-dumping, subsidies, countervailing measures, safeguards, state trading enterprise issues, including advising dispute settlement panels. In 2010, Raul was out the sixth WTO fellow at the Institute for International Trade of the University of Adelaide in Australia. He also contributed books on the WTO and then the multilateral trading system, published articles on the anti-dumping, WTO dispute settlement, small economies, landlocked developing countries, and the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, strengthening Africa's trade capacity and free zones. You see, Raul is really an expert on that issues, and we are planning now on to organize now November 4th. As I would like to remind you, before the MC12, we're going to organize the trade ministerial meeting of the landlocked developing countries virtually. So in that preparation is also Raul is also one of the key partners here in the WTO. So my question to Raul would be, what is the role of the international trade and aid for trade in the building productive capacities in LLDCs? So thank you, Raul. You have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for inviting WTO to participate in this interesting panel. And I also thank my fellow panelists for their comments. And in answering that question, Ambassador, I think that we need to have a clear picture of where we are with the LLDC trade and aid for trade flows, particularly after the pandemic. And fortunately, at the moment, the WTO Secretariat is working on a study on the trade of LLDC. So we have some fresh data on these issues. So when it comes to the impact of COVID-19 on the LLDCs, we have a kind of a mixed picture, in fact, because the pandemic has affected the different LLDCs in a different manner. So overall, yes, there has been quite a drop and a decline in trade from the LLDCs. This amounts to about 11% if we compare it to in 2020, if we compare it to the exports of LLDCs in 2019. But interestingly, when we look at the least developed countries among the LLDCs, we can see that there has actually been a 3.3% increase in their exports. So what is happening here? Of course, well, you know, what we're seeing is that the LLDCs are having higher volume of exports of gold and precious metals, and that has allowed them to capitalize on high world market prices on these products. And they have also enjoyed a stable demand for agricultural products as this was less affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is also interesting to specifically look at the products that are being exported by LLDCs. And not surprisingly, and all of my fellow panelists have made this point, that we see a high concentration of exports of raw materials and commodities by the LLDCs. And we see that this is particularly the case for gas and petroleum products, which make up a large part of LLDC exports. But we are already seeing some positive movements in terms of diversification of exports. And in 2020, we saw large surges of exports of electricity and also of exports of semi-manufactured gold. So again, minerals, metals playing a large role in the exports of LLDCs. So this may point the way as to where investment productive capacity may be more effective or have a more immediate impact. Now, when it comes to services exports, which is also an important area for us to focus, the effects of COVID-19 have been much harsher. LLDCs were very much affected by the restrictions imposed on travel, resulting from in a decline of about 36% in services exports And this is a sharper decline that we saw in the rest of the world. So that means that LLDCs have really been more acutely affected. So the problem here has been that the cross-movement restrictions, cross-border movement restrictions have really affected the sectors where LLDCs had more of an exporting offer of services. These are particularly tourism, transport, and construction. So those are the three sectors where we have seen that the LLDCs concentrate their exports, and of course they have been very much affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So this highlights the importance of not only diversifying production in goods, but also diversifying the offer of services that the LLDCs have. And again, we're seeing some positive developments here. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic had a shift towards remote working and digitalization, and this has actually boosted computer services exports of the LLDCs. Computer services grew on average by 10% in 2020 in LLDCs, and this marks a more rapid growth than what we saw even in the rest of the world. So I think that again, this is somewhere where we can see that the constraints of LLDCs play a lesser role. So it would be important to invest in these areas. Now, looking at aid for trade flows, since 2006, LLDCs have received close to $85 billion in aid for trade disbursements. In 2019, and we usually have a little bit of a gap between the reporting and the and when we can have actually the data. We saw in 2019, so we haven't been able to capture yet the effects of the pandemic on aid for trade flows, but we saw that in 2019 there were disbursements of 7.7 billion, which is less than what we had in 2018, which was 8 billion. And the share of aid for trade going to LLDCs as compared to global disbursements has remained stable since 2017, and this is around 17%. So 17% of the aid for trade goes to LLDCs. And what sectors does it go to? So most of it goes to building energy infrastructure, so productive capacity in energy, 27.6% on agriculture productive capacity, 20.1% on transport and storage infrastructure, and 21% for the rest of the categories. So maybe we're already starting to see here, you know, if we look at the trends in exports of LLDCs, some of the fruits of that investment. So I think that it's important to continue investing in LLDCs and investing in productive capacity, but we also need to realize that investing in this area is particularly resource intensive. I mean, you need a lot of capital to be able to build this productive capacity, and we shouldn't forget that we also need to continue investing in some other areas, particularly focusing on reducing trade costs. And here, you know, obviously implementation of this TFA is a particularly important item, as well as investing in facilitating trade through soft infrastructure, such as the Asecura program of UNCTAD that promotes customs automation. And also WTO has some projects on the STDF to build capacity to meet SPS requirements, and the Trade Facilitation Assistance Facility. And this hopefully will help catalyze also private investment to make up for a fall in aid for trade. Now, Another program where I think, or another area where I think it's important to keep up the investment is that of digital connectivity. Of course, we have seen the importance of this area during the pandemic and its potential for growth. And here, yet another program by UNCTAD is showing the way forward on how to conduct investment in this area. And we're talking here about the E-Trade for All initiative. And lastly, I think that we still also need to focus on some regulatory issues that can be addressed at the multilateral level. And one that may need further attention from the international community is this interplay between rules of origin and the trade by LLDCs. Because currently, in order for exports to meet origin requirements, we see that they usually have to be a direct consignment from the LLDC to the country of destination, and which make it difficult because these shipments may be undergoing transit operations, so it prevents transshipment in the transit countries, so it's important that to have more flexible direct transportation rules and rules of origin to reflect the specific connectivity challenges of LLDCs. And this may be particularly important now that we have this very difficult situation with container shortages and high shipping costs.
Thank you, Raul. That was very important, especially now before the MC12. So we really, the landlocked countries, one of the vulnerable issues is the transport. As we know, it's that now the shortage of the containers and the rising transit prices. In some countries, in 10 times the price is high. World average is 3 times, but for the LLDCs is more than 6, 7, and some high 10 times. So that is really time now. Also, thank you again. You are mentioning about the rule of origin. That's important for the LLDCs to enjoy that the preferential tariffs and do that rules. Sometimes we are not able to enjoy that preferential tariffs. So I saw yet no questions, but I would like to maybe ask the panelists maybe one questions and also 2 questions, and then a wrap up for each maybe 1 minute. So first, my question will be, as a result of the pandemic, the governments, also companies, started to move their production back to home or in a close neighborhood. So how will this trend affect the LLDC's productivity? So that is maybe, I'm going to start with Mr. Akiwakani. And the second question is, now they're recovering after the pandemic, it will be digital one, and also service lead recovery. And for that, really, the digital transformation or transition is very, very important. But on the other hand, this digital divide is the reality, and how we should overcome it and how we should deal with that. That is a question. And then I want to ask maybe first Paul Akawumi, and then followed by Dr. Chukwuka Nikwana. Please, Paul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Well, with regard to the reshoring that's happening now in across the world, where people are looking at their value chains and seeing how they can reshore products to deal with it themselves. This is critical because this will have a significant impact on LLDCs and LDCs as a whole. And that's why we have always advocated the point about building your productive capacities. And in the previous discussion where the panelists raised all these issues about strong institutions and trade logistics and diversifying, this is all about productive capacities. You want to build your infrastructure to support a new development model, which is a diversified economy. most of the LLDCs, as we've heard from our colleague from WTO, is still commodity driven. And the infrastructure and the trade logistics and the institutions are all built simply to support that commodity rather than diversify. So it's critical that they are going to diversify and that they are going to build their productive capacity. Institutions have been indicated as being weak. And this is primarily because of this situation where they are not diversified, they're focused on extractive industry. And I might add that with regard to the extractive sector, UNCTAD has recently done a lot of work on illicit financial flows, and it's very clear that there's a correlation between illicit financial flows and weak institutions in countries. And also that the knock-on effect is that these countries who have weak institutions, have high illicit financial flows, are the same governments which spend less on health, less on education, less on women, less on children. So these have knock-on effects, but the primary thing being the weak institutions, the productive capacity diversified. Now, with regard to ICTs and the digital economy and servicing, this is also very critical for LLDCs. It's important, but it's important for you. We have this whole program on e-commerce readiness for LLDCs, LDCs, and the strategy development, as my colleague from WTO mentioned. But it's also critical that you have energy to run the digital economy. It's also critical that you have strong institutions. It's also critical that you have the trained manpower who can absorb this new technology. And it's also critical that you're using ICTs, not just for consumption, not just to buy things from abroad or Amazon, but to use for the institutions and for the productive sector to actually produce goods and services, to be able to. Lastly, I'd mention that with regard to trade, transport and trade facilitation, UNCTAD also does a considerable amount of work on that. And we have just launched a project in West Africa. We're primarily looking at those landlocked countries, Benin, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. And we're looking at how we can support corridors, that we can ensure that there's smooth trade. And the colleagues mentioned the soft infrastructure. And this is critical that you have a soft infrastructure for that. That's precisely what we're working on. But there are clear bottlenecks that will come into play. Lack of energy in these border posts to actually even run software and everything else. Lack of trained personnel in these border posts and everywhere along the line. So there are critical problems and issues with regard to institutions, as I mentioned, with regard to the whole issue of productive class, having the energy, the categories I mentioned, energy, human capital, the institutions, the information technology, the natural capital, the private sector, structural change. So what the uniqueness of our index is that it can point to you where you need to focus on specifically, rather than generally, specifically where you need to focus on, which will help these governments to be able to benefit from this. And rightly, Mr. Chair, you mentioned the digital divide between North and South, between developed and developing countries, between LLDCs, LDCs, developing countries. But you should not forget that there is, within the LLDCs, there is a digital divide within the countries themselves. When you have a lot of e-governance going on, and people in the rural areas can't even renew their driving licenses. So we have to be cognizant of these issues. And that's why it's so critical that productive capacity is built across the nation. And we will be launching, and we have started already looking at not just productive capacity at the national level, but productive capacity within the country at the provincial level. So governments can focus their policies to ensure that they can build it in certain areas where they need it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. And then I would like to invite now the Dr. Chukwuka Anikwena on the seven questions, but you have 1 minute, please.
All right, yeah, so on the first question, to highlight the trend that you mentioned, I think there is need for concerted and conscious efforts towards diversification of the economies of these LLDCs that will see a movement away from commodity dependence towards domestic production. It needs to identify key sectors which could be low-hanging fruits for them to develop and stimulate production, and also huge investments in infrastructure, which enables domestic production in these countries. On digitalization, it is clear from the pandemic that a post-COVID world will bring about a lot of emphasis on digitalization. Digitalization increases the efficiency of different services and also can also boost the productivity of different sectors. But as like you said, there is a digital divide across countries and even within. So these LLDCs will need a lot of investment in infrastructure, ICT infrastructure to increase internet access in order to harness the benefits of digitalization. However, there's also the need for digital governance, because as digitalization increases, it also brings about the need for digital governance, which curtails issues of abuse and other misuse that could come from the increase in digitalization. So these are the key reactions to your questions. So.
Thank you, Dr. Kunana. And then I would like to invite now the Ms. Schroeder-Fox. Please, you have the 1 minute.
Thank you very much. I will be very brief. I will just focus on the issue, the last question on the digital revolution and the opportunities that really the COVID pandemic, as it pushed us into a remote working mode and focused on the digitalization issue in our countries. What is this opportunity? It's not only about just talking about e-commerce and e-trade. In the countries, you need to have access to broadband, access to affordable, reliable energy. So infrastructure is key, but then in addition to that, we need to have capacity building so that people can understand, know how to use the opportunities. And it's also about the affordability and the availability of the technology itself and the kind of means of using this technology that is absolutely crucial. And for us, the implementation of the roadmap of Vienna Program of Action is really the opportunity to push this agenda forward. And I cannot emphasize enough that there are opportunities for landlocked member states to come together and forge partnerships and move these issues forward. So we need to make sure that we really truly implement the Vienna Program of Action, and digitalization is an important part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. My last question goes to Raul. Maybe WTO not so much, I think, dealing with the productivity part is the mainly dealing with the trade. But before you trade, you should produce something. But for their production now, all the digital is that technology transfer is very, very important. And then we have the working group within the WTO, and what could do then in that WTO, in that atmosphere, that the LLDCs could have the broader access to the technologies.
Yes, thank you. And then, well, very briefly, I think that you rightly pointed out that we have a working group on trade and transfer of technology. Unfortunately, the working group, which was set up after the, at the Doha Ministerial Conference, it has not been producing the desired results, and the discussions are largely at a standstill. So I think that this is an issue where LLDCs and the rest of developing countries should focus on, and maybe a solution would be to elevate these discussions to either the TRIPS Council or another forum such as the General Council. But this is definitely going to be a crucial issue, both in the question of the fight of the pandemic and in adaptation to climate change.
Thank you, Raul. I think our time is over, and then let me thank on behalf of the participants, our panelists. It was very good, intensive discussion, and we touched also many issues. And thank you, especially UNCTAD, also that initiating that session, presenting that a new policy tool on the productive capacity index. And we will continue definitely that talks also in common forums. And thank you again, and then all the best. And then now session is closed.